All right, so what I'm going to talk about today is one of the parts of debate that beginners find a lot of times the most intimidating because it's the one where you have to do the most thinking on your feet. I'm going to talk about cross-examination, and I haven't aimed this at absolute beginners. I would say this is for someone who is right at the end of their beginning phase, or you are a very new intermediate debater. You know things like you should be facing the judge, you know things like you don't make statements, you ask questions, you know all of the basics, and you've even been through a few cross-examinations. You kind of have a feel for it. It's not a mystery to you. So here are some ways you can grow beyond that and start to use cross-examination a little bit more effectively, a little bit more of an offensive weapon. And I'm going to divide up into the content of your cross-examination and your demeanor during cross-examination. And the content I'm going to split into three sections. Taking care of your business, some good strategic questioning, and then finally some questions not to ask. So taking care of your business. When you are negative and you're the 2N cross-examining the first affirmative, you need to make sure that the first thing you do is ask them for the plan. This is, of course, talking about team policy. But you need to look at the plan, and you need to make sure that anything at all that strikes you as not quite right or ambiguous, could be interpreted more than one way, you ask them questions to pin them down on what it means. Because that's the last chance you're going to get. The debate is going to be underway soon. You're going to be committing to positions. Spend some quality time clarifying the plan. The same is true, by the way, when the first affirmative is cross-examining the first negative if there's a counterplan in the debate. You want to look at the counterplan text and be very clear on what it does. And the same is also true, incidentally, if you happen to debate in front of a judging pool that can take some theory debating, and so the affirmative is likely to introduce a permutation into the debate to talk about competition. In that case, it's really important in the cross-examination of the 2AC that you find out what exactly is the permutation, and it's not a bad idea to ask your opponent to write it down and to make sure that you have a shared understanding of it. So that's the first part of taking care of business. Whatever there is in the debate that someone has put forth as a proposal, in the case of the affirmative plan as an advocacy and a counterplan or a permutation as a test, in any of those instances, you've got to be real clear exactly what you're debating, and that's the first part of taking care of business. The second part of taking care of business, and I assume this is something that if you've seen more advanced debaters, this is what they do a lot of in cross-examination. When you are listening to your opponent speak, and your opponent is reading evidence, and the evidence doesn't match the tag, or the evidence is very generic and has nothing to do with your particular affirmative. So you're running a military affirmative or a UN reform affirmative, and they read evidence about generally how government officials are corrupted by industry lobbying, and you listen, and the evidence is about farm subsidies from the 1970s. It has nothing to do with your affirmative. It is making a point about how lobbying does sway government officials, but it's way, way, way out of the domain of your affirmative. Now, what you do, it is critically, critically important when you have judges who aren't flowing, that you get that evidence, you ask them to see that evidence, and you make the point that that evidence is not on point to what's being debated, that evidence is generic. It is not what you're talking about and therefore doesn't cut against you at all. Those are the kinds of things when you have a judge who's flowing that you can discuss the merits of the evidence and you can just do it in the course of your speech. But when you've got a judge who isn't flowing, or a judge who's just sort of taking casual notes, and you want that impression to last, the exchange that you have with your opponent, where you ask them, well, isn't this talking just about farm subsidies? Isn't this talking about an old farm subsidy program back in the 1970s? That's the kind of thing that will anchor it in their memory, and then in your last rebuttal, if you need to, you can remind the judge of that exchange, and that's likely to be a lot more effective. So, make sure you know what any plan text, counterplan text, permutation text says, and for judges who aren't flowing, make real sure that any evidence that is power tagged or any evidence that is generic, that you point that out in an exchange with your opponent and try to pin your opponent down that that's not what that evidence says or that is not what that evidence is talking about. Okay. So the second phase of the content of cross-examination questions, some good strategic things that you can do with your cross-examination. The first thing that I think it's important that you do with any offensive positions or any positions in the debate that you think are going to be really pivotal. It could be that they have a really strong solvency argument and you have a stock issues judge. Anything that you think that they may be pinning the debate on, What you want to try to do, and this is a skill that you can build, and you can do it through drills when you're having practice debates or practice speeches, is step back and do the "so your position is," "so your position is." And then the way you finish that sentence is to make their argument sound silly. Now, not hostile, not insulting, not rude, and we're going to get to the reasons why when we talk about demeanor, but silly. So let's say it's a topicality argument. All right, so your position is on a topic about United Nations reform that it's unfair to expect you to debate membership on the Security Council. That's your position. You know, what you do is you step back and you take the gut check, because what debaters are often very guilty of doing is they get so caught up in the minutia. They think about debates, they think about debate arguments as puzzle pieces that come together, and they never look at the image of the entire puzzle. So what you want to do, that's where you think about the internal links of the disadvantages. You know, they may have a pretty good explanation of why there's an initial link. Maybe it's a politics disadvantage, and they have a pretty good explanation of why the plan's going to be controversial. And maybe they have pretty good evidence for their impact, and that impact looks big, and you think, wow, we're in trouble on this. But that's where you stop and you say, okay, now hold it. So your position is that this presidential election between Romney and Obama is really going to turn on deployments in Okinawa and whether there is local jurisdiction for people accused of crimes under local law. You think that's going to come up in the presidential debates? You think they're going to make campaign advertisements about that? Talk about the internal link. The initial link may be pretty good. The impact may be pretty impressive. But talk about how they get from the initial link to the impact, and that's where that's where you can, in cross-examination, do that step back and say, so your position is. Now, if you go too far, if you make this hostile, so your position is that anybody who's running Security Council membership reform should just be disqualified and kicked out of the league, well, that's going over the top. You have to be kind of gentle about this. You want to push it a little bit in the direction of this argument is unreasonable. You want to drop a hint about that, and you're going to get them started talking about why, but then that's the kind of thing where you can banter with them a little bit, and you can be kind of lighthearted, and you can even kind of smile about this argument and convey a sense to the judge of, isn't it silly, the debate arguments we sometimes try to get away with, but without coming across as a jerk. So, your position is a move that you ought to make several times in a cross-examination, because it can undercut the entire gestalt of the argument, the way the argument comes together, and that's the kind of thing you can come back to in the last rebuttal. Especially if you hit upon a good way to characterize the argument as a little bit silly, that's not overly hostile. That can become a phrase that shows up a lot when you're in the end game and you're trying to sell to the judge that this is not an argument that you should lose the debate on. Okay, a second good strategic move. This one, with all these, you have to be pretty careful. These are slightly advanced techniques, but ask them why. Now, the danger with asking why, you don't ask why about big sweeping issues. So your plan will solve the problem, right? Why? Well, if you do that, they'll fill your 3 minutes with reasons why. But go to real, small, specific arguments, specific line item arguments, especially complicated ones where you suspect that they may not understand the arguments. And just ask them, why? Call them out on it. So maybe they say the economy is going to get better because the Federal Reserve Board has gone a different direction with quantitative easing, and you can tell from the level of confidence as they presented the argument that they're not really sure what it means. So then you say, okay, so the Fed and quantitative easing, what they're about to do at the next meeting is going to make the economy better, right? Right. Why? And what you'll find sometimes is that they'll say, well, you know, I may not know all the ins and outs of it, but this is a very qualified source, and we're relying on the source's credentials, and it's published in a pretty prestigious fact-checked publication. Don't let them get away with that. That's where, gently, not in a hostile fashion, that's where you say, well, now hold it. What we really want to do is we want to debate you on the reasons behind the arguments. And our judge here is going to have to make a decision at the end of this round who did the better debating. So help me understand why it is that the judge ought to conclude that you did the better debating if I ask you what the reason is behind your argument and you say, I don't know the reason, I'm just quoting an expert. That's the kind of thing where with arguments that sound sophisticated and might actually impress the judge and might actually make them look as if they're very informed, you can call them out and you can catch them. Now, if it turns out that they can explain the argument, then you've wasted a little bit of cross-examination time because you've really let them, you've sort of eased the work that they would need to do later in the debate about re-explaining the argument, and you run that risk. One thing you have to remember is with every question you ask, with every time you let your opponent answer in cross-examination, you are giving them a little bit of airtime to explain what's going on. So you're going to gamble constantly. If you choose poorly, then an argument that maybe the judge wouldn't have understood or would have discounted will suddenly make sense to them, and that is a result of your choice, and that can, hurt you. But you're not perfectly in control of what happens in cross-examination because it is kind of fluid and dynamic. So if it turns out that you ask a question and they answer it really well, shrug it off. A lot of that happens. A debate is 2 hours long or an hour and change long, and you are not going to win absolutely every sortie. So pick things where you think that you have the potential to make a little ground, to establish a toehold that you can use later on in your next speech. And if it doesn't go well, don't worry about it. But where you think you've got them on arguments they don't understand, why? Just call them out, see if they can explain it, and if they can't, make the point that if they can't explain it, that's not an argument that is really establishing that they're doing the better debating. Okay, yet another move. This one you have to play test for a while until you feel really comfortable doing it, and that is to play a little judo. To take an argument that you would really like for them to set up for you and to figure out a way to move in the opposite direction, to bait them into giving you what you need. So maybe it's an affirmative on the military commitments topic and it's about supply lines in a particular part of the world that's very hard to resupply. Maybe it's about resupplying in Central Asia, in our bases in Central and Southeast Asia. I'm making this up. I don't know if these details would really support an argument like this. But let's say that's what you're debating. So you look at the plan text and it says that we are going to accept offers and we're going to put in forward basing in these particular parts of the world. And if I were doing that, if I were looking at that plan text, I might say, wow, this looks like the kind of plan where there are going to be unexpected circumstances and cost overruns. How is this going to work if we're trying to keep all these bases supplied and they're outstripping their budgets every year when they don't have any more funds and they don't have any more resources to get to the troops that we have based actually out in hostile territory? What are they going to do? And that's the kind of thing where I'm sort of roughing that out. You would want to do this in practice rounds and practice speeches to get to where you felt really confident with the sort of reverse psychology to draw them in the direction you want. But if I were to say that, this looks like the kind of plan where a lot of unexpected things could happen. What are you going to do if there's a cost overrun and you don't have enough? What you're baiting them into do is you're baiting them into saying, well, we'll provide them with what they need. I mean, these are our troops in the field. We are going to give them the resources necessary. There's nothing in the plan that constrains them and says that there's a hard budget line there, and when that's gone, there just isn't anymore. And every word that they say is actually feeding your spending argument. Because that's what you wanted them to say in the first place, that they are going to provide all the funding necessary, all the resources necessary, and you're sitting there with a very well written, very well updated budget agreement disadvantage and investor panic disadvantage. And when you're able to say in explaining the link, they've said that the plan gets a blank check, that anytime anything unexpected happens, they're just going to throw more money at it. That's going to help you make your link argument for you. So whether it's that you need to bait them into saying that their plan would compete with a counter plan, or that there's something about the plan that sets up your topicality argument, sets up your critique argument, whatever it is, think about what kind of argument could you drop hints about? What kind of argument, plausible argument, could you suggest you see the potential for yourself to run and you're trying to set up with your question? But if they think they see the drift of the question, make them run the other direction and make them run right into what you want them to say. That's the kind of thing that when you have practice debates and practice speeches, practice it and see if you can fool the other members of your club. See if you can fool whoever it is who's listening to your practice speech. And over time, if you get good at it, you can get them to help you make some concessions that make your job a lot easier. All right, so the strategic offensive things to do. Take a step back and do a reality check. So your position is, with specific, limited arguments, especially complex ones. Ask why and check whether they can explain them. And third, play a little judo, a little martial arts, reverse psychology. Try to get them to run in the opposite direction of what they think you're going to run. But instead, they give you the concession. They describe the plan in such a way that it sets up the argument you really want to run. Okay, now, some things not to do. Some things that I have commonly seen beginning to intermediate debaters do that you should make sure you're not doing. The first is, don't take an argument that you want to make but that has not appeared in the debate yet and just cloak it as a question. What I mean by that is, let's say you've got really good evidence that Congress passed a bill yesterday that addresses the harm in the 1AC, and you think you've got this really good case takeout. Were you aware of that? And then talk about what happened yesterday. Don't do that. Don't try to make the argument in cross-examination just by tacking something like, did you know that? Do you therefore still believe what you said in the first speech in light of this evidence? And I see people do that all the time because they feel kind of stuck. They're new at cross-examination, still moderately new. They're still not that confident digging around in the arguments that were made, so they think, okay, I'll just run to my own evidence. Don't do that. Really be strict with yourself and force yourself to dig into the issues that are already in the debate. Now, you've already heard me say that you can try to set up some of the arguments you're going to make as far as getting them to describe their plan in such a way that your disadvantage link will work, or to try to get them to, because it goes both ways, try to get them to describe their disadvantage in such a way that you can then turn the disadvantage if you're affirmative cross-examining the negative. So it is okay to think about the arguments you're going to make in the next speech and try to get them to characterize what they've already said to put you in a good position. But don't take arguments you just haven't made at all and try to introduce them in cross-examination. And that is a not that uncommon mistake that I see only moderately experienced debaters make. The second thing that you shouldn't do, anytime you are going to ask them about a flawed argument, anytime you're going to ask them about something that you saw that you think is a mistake, be careful, because you may let them out of it. So, for example, let's say that you're the second affirmative and you made a bunch of answers to some offensive argument that's in the debate. Let's say they ran a topicality argument, you made your 3 or 4 answers, and the second negative only answered the first 2 and then just missed the last 2. You don't, in cross-examination, say, by the way, did you drop the last 2 arguments on topicality? You know, you may be rolling your eyes at that, but you'd be surprised how many people do it. Because what that then lets them do is it lets them say, oh, well, that was answered up here where I made these arguments. And then all the judge knows is, you know, maybe the second negative meant to group those arguments and didn't come right out and say it, but it was a slight flowing error as opposed to those arguments were cold, conceded. So if letting them explain, if introducing, pointing it out to them in cross-examination is going to give them a chance to wiggle out of the mess that they've made for themselves, don't do it. There's another video up on the vlog where I talk about double turns, and you want to be really careful about talking your opponent through a double turn in cross-examination, because a lot of times they will, on the spur of the moment, from feeling pretty panicked, come up with an explanation that makes it all very consistent. I've seen hundreds of debaters do this over the years, whereas if you just hold off and in your speech say, this is what they said, this is what they said, it's a clean double turn. Then in their next speech, they might say, oh no, these are consistent, here's why. But then you, in your last rebuttal, can be a little skeptical of that and say, well, of course they want to characterize it that way now, but that's not the argument the way they originally made it. And the judge will remember what they said, how you then anchored in your own description of it, and presumably you'll say the same thing you heard them say. So they're working a lot harder at that point to erase the impression than they are if you have a little conversation and cross-examination about it. So when you get tempted to point out a mistake that you think your opponent made, be very, very careful because you may be letting them out of it. I think the way you gauge that is take your impression of the person you're cross-examining. How fluent are they? How good on their feet? How smooth? When they have to come up with an argument out of nowhere with just a moment's notice, how good are they at that? If they're the kind of person who freezes, if they're the kind of person who gets a little tongue-tied, then yes, maybe you can point out the flaws in the argument, save yourself a little bit of speech time later on. But if they are a very experienced debater and they're very quick, then sit on those mistakes. You've noticed them, Don't draw their attention to the danger that they've created for themselves. Make them do the much harder work of trying to get out of it in their next speech. Okay, another thing that you want to do is, it's a good idea to, if you can, get off a good lighthearted joke in cross-examination. It's a good idea to be friendly. It is not a good idea to be cutesy. It is not a good idea to do something that comes across as formulaic. So, hey, how are you doing today? You having a good tournament? Well, sometimes if you're the kind of person who genuinely comes across as you're warm, you never met a stranger, you just really like people, that can be effective. And that, I'm about to get to talking about demeanor, and that can give the judge a really good impression of you. But a lot of times it comes across as fake. It comes across as, well, their coach told them to do this. I'd really prefer that they be a little bit more businesslike and get on with it. So you want to be a little bit cautious with that. And one last thing that's kind of right on the borderline between content and demeanor, there's this phrase, I am now open for cross-examination. And sometimes there's the longer version of it. I am now open for cross-examination on points of clarification. And I have seen people who are so addicted to this phrase that if their opponent just finished a speech and didn't say it, they'll look up and they'll say, are you now open for cross-examination? Now, it might be that where you debate in your region, that's the kind of thing that everybody does find kind of traditional, comforting, and judges think something's amiss if you don't use that particular incantation. I hope not, because, I mean, that thing's a cliche. There's no real need for it. I remember years ago there was a college team from Southwest Missouri State, and I only saw this once. I don't know why I didn't see it more often, but the one debater got to the end of his constructive and finished the last sentence of the last argument, looked over at his opponents and said, questions, guys? And I thought that was really good. Spoke to them in an informal, very inviting, very human tone and manner. And that's actually a pretty good segue for me to get into talking about demeanor. Because what you have to understand is that judges, deep down, know who they want to win. Now, judges try to be fair. I think the overwhelming majority try their very best to make very good decisions. But it is the nature of the human being that we do develop impressions. We develop impressions of who we like a little bit less. And in a situation where the winning move or the fatal mistake is just absolutely glaring, then most judges who are trying their best, they will vote for the team that clearly won the debate. But so few debates actually come down like that. So many debates are actually a little bit of a muddle and could be justified either way. One of the things over the long term that you want to do if you want to win a lot of debates, and you also just want to do it to be a good person, is to be likable, to be human, to be a warm and friendly person. So, the first thing, this was taught to me years ago when I was first starting out in debate as the law of inverse heat. As they get hotter, you get cooler. So, if they're starting out, they're at a baseline, they're handling their business fine, they're debating normally, then you should be very businesslike, interested in them, enjoying the debate, but kind of in a low-key way. If they start to get heated up, if they start to get mad at you, if they start to get aggressive and they're barking their answers, it can be very tempting to mirror that. It can be very tempting to give it back, to snap at them in return and say, well, you're being a jerk. Well, don't do that. As they show signs that they are upset, you get real pleasant. You put the smile on your face. Now, how do you do that without faking it? One of the things is to remind yourself, a lot of times when you see debaters get tense like that, it's out of fear. It's because they feel like they're under a lot of pressure, and a lot of times they're very competitive by nature. And so they're having kind of a bad moment. They think the debate is not going well. And what I would try to do, especially late in my debate career, it would bring out the caregiver in me, and I would try to help them unwind. And, you know, if I could think of a good joke that would break the tension, then, and a good joke that was not at their expense, but a joke that they could be in on, maybe even throw them a straight line to where they could get the joke off. You know, that's where, as you ask the questions, you want to have more of a smile on your face. You want to just be participating in a calm and warm discussion. Now, what happens a lot of times is they'll continue to get more and more tense. And you just talk in a soothing tone, in a reassuring tone, and a few things happen. First of all, you're handling them the right way. You're trying to be helpful. By itself, it's a good way to proceed. Secondly, the judge will notice. The contrast between you and your opponent gets to be huge. And so what I was talking about a few minutes ago, judges know who they want to win. The first thing that your demeanor will tell them is that you are the kind of person that they want to win the debate, that they'll be a little bit happier if you wind up winning the debate. Now, the other impression your demeanor will give the judge is that you know what you're talking about or that you don't know what you're talking about. So one of the things that I think it's a very good idea to do when you're participating in cross-examination as the questioner or as the respondent is to keep a good, steady, energetic tempo going. When I talk about how you want to be calm and reassuring and pleasant, that doesn't mean that you go slowly. And when I say a good tempo going, I don't mean you talk fast. I mean that as you ask each question and you hear their answer, you immediately ask another question. And the impression that you give is that you are very alert, you are concentrating, the questions come to you immediately, and you are going to make the most of these 3 minutes. You have a lot of things that you want to know. And it's the kind of thing, it's the kind of ability that you should be building up in practice debates, that your cross-examination is not hostile and not angry, but it is aggressive. You are going to put a little pressure just by constantly having another question to ask. Or if you're the person answering questions, the second they've got to the last word of the question, boom, you start answering it. And I'll further add that when you want to establish that tempo and you want to project confidence, that you do know what you're talking about, that the judge ought to trust you on anything that sounds like a close call, that's why you don't give long, rambling answers. Now, you may have heard it said that if someone asks an open-ended question, you should talk all day and eat up their cross-ex time. But the problem is that can make a real bad impression on the judge. It can make you seem very long-winded, and it can seem like a little gamesmanship. What you ought to do instead is answer the question, answer it thoroughly and completely, say what you need to say, but say it in as few words as possible, because what that conveys is confidence. So, first of all, you want to be likable, and secondly, you want to have a good, sharp tempo to the cross-examination, whatever side of it you happen to be on. One of the corollaries to that is don't ask multiple questions at once. How much is your plan going to cost, and do you have adequate funding for that? That's 2 questions. So what's your best estimate of how much the plan costs? Okay, where's that money going to come from? 1 question at a time. Boom, boom, boom. Have a definite rhythm. Now, what do you do when they are trying to ramble on and on, they're eating up all your time? Well, that's one of those times where you want to be confident, you want to be assertive, but you also want to be enjoying yourself and likable. So that's where you use some nonverbals to convey to the judge, not to your opponent, but to the judge, that you want back into the conversation. So maybe you put one hand up, maybe say, okay, hold it. I have another question I have to ask you. But you don't do any of those things. This is my cross-examination. That just makes you seem very unlikable. So be noticeable, be conspicuous, and watch for a break where they take a breath and just get a single word in. But, well, okay, different question. And you can insert yourself in, and oftentimes, if they keep talking at that point, then at least the judge is likely to take note of it, and still the contrast between you and them it's the kind of thing that'll diverge, and the judge will form a definite impression of you that when it comes down to the end of the debate, and they're making close calls either for you or against you, that's going to help you. So be assertive, and don't let them run away with your cross-examination, but don't cross the line to where you're actually snapping at them. Just be noticeable, let it be noticeable to the judge that you are trying to take your turn back. Okay, a few other things. You actually may have heard me use this a few minutes ago, but a phrase that I used to use a lot when I was debating, and it was a way not to be a jerk, but a way to phrase a question diplomatically, and that was, help me understand. Help me understand this. That's a gentle way of saying, that makes no sense. Help me understand why it is that you don't specify which branch of the government is going to do the plan. That's not written into the plan. Help me understand why that is a fair way to set the debate up, given how many arguments on this particular topic, assuming a hypothetical topic, really depend on interbranch conflict. Help me understand that. It's the kind of thing where where demeanor was really important and I was trying to make a good impression on the judge, you also take the volume of your voice down just a little bit. So, debaters ordinarily, when they're talking, they put a little bit of punch behind their voice. But then, when you're trying to de-escalate and you're trying to draw back from a debater who may be getting a little heated up at you, that's when you say, okay, help me understand why. Did you hear that? Help me understand. And as a matter of fact, my debaters have actually got trained to where a lot of them know that whenever I say help me understand, what I'm really saying is what you just said was fairly dumb. So rethink it because I don't think you're making any sense at the moment. Okay, one last good trick. And that is when your opponent is being weaselly, when your opponent is not committing to things that they ought to commit to, that's a good, you can sometimes work it into a good opportunity to give them some of that back. And here's the best example I can think of. I am not a fan of agent specification arguments, even though I used one as a hypothetical a second ago. But I remember watching a quarterfinal debate at the National Debate Tournament between Dartmouth and the University of Texas. And Dartmouth was trying to set up the agent specification argument after the 1AC. They actually, what they really wanted to do was to run they wanted a counterplan with a different branch of government, but no agent was written into the 1AC plan. So Dartmouth says, which branch? Executive, Congress, judicial, that's all we want. Which branch? And Texas said, it's what you in your research have found that normal means would be. And if you want to read evidence what normal means is, then we will debate you on that. But we're going to make you read the link evidence. And that's all Texas would say. And Dartmouth kept saying, look, it's your plan. It's your plan, and we're asking you to clarify a detail of it. Which branch does it? And Texas said, we will commit to if you have evidence what normal means would be, then that will be, for the purposes of the plan, what the plan does, and we will debate you on that. So then, there was a different topicality argument in the debate that the second negative spent a lot of time on, and I remember there was this moment where the Texas 2A asked the Dartmouth 2N a question about their interpretation, and the Dartmouth 2N just looked over at him and said, whatever normal means is. And it got a big laugh from all the judges, and the judges at that moment really kind of sympathized with Dartmouth. You know, if Texas is not going to commit to things, Texas can't complain about Dartmouth not committing to things, especially when Texas is not committing to details of the plan, and all Dartmouth's not committing to, or they're being a little slow to commit to, is a detail of a topicality interpretation. So, and the one thing that this Dartmouth debater did is he didn't come across as surly, it didn't come across as a complaint, he had a little bit of a grin on his face while he said it, but he also scored a really important point. So if someone's being slippery, and they're really not committing to things that reasonably they ought to, one of the ways that you can handle that is just look for an opening to give them a little bit of that back, especially if they have a phrase that they're using a lot to try to get out of answering your question. All right. So, the things that are the top priority are knowing what people's proposals are and calling them out on mistagged evidence if you have a judge who isn't flowing. There are then after that a few strategic questions that you can use that put big pictures of the book, put pieces of the argument together into big pictures that call them out on arguments that they may or may not understand, and also that can set up a link, can set up a piece of the argument that you really need by maybe misleading them a little bit about what you're really thinking early in the debate. There are some mistakes that you want to avoid, chiefly having to do with giving them extra speech time to back out of mistakes they've made and tipping your hand where you want to go. And then finally, when it comes to demeanor, you want to be very confident, very in control, very assertive, but there's this huge, huge danger that you can get into a spiral of hostility. So you need to be the one who leans in the opposite direction and is pleasant and warm and affirming to your opponents, partly because that's the right thing to do, and that is enough reason even if the judge doesn't notice it. But a nice side effect, a nice fringe benefit, a nice byproduct is the judge very likely will notice it, and in close debates it can be what tips the outcome. So those are things that you ought to think about and you ought to take into your practice rounds, and you can take cross-examination and turn it into the part of the debate, honestly, that you like the best. Most of the debaters that I knew who stuck around into the late stages of a debate career to where they were really competitive, they got to where they kind of looked forward to it. It was kind of like blood sport, and they didn't feel any sense of intimidation. It was like, let's match wits and let's see who can do this the best. And it would be great if you get to that stage as well.